Greetings, M squared here. Today we are going to talk about completing the square when a is greater than 1. So you'll see that in our little equations we have a number in front of the x squared, the coefficient of the x squared, the quadratic coefficient. So those are going to be bigger than 1. So we do it a little different. We got to use a little factoring. So here are our steps, right? We're still going to move c to the right side like we did yesterday. But now we have to do this step too. So a is not 1, so we're going to have to divide everything by a. And then we continue. Oh, I guess we're not doing factoring until we change it to vertex form. That's the next video. Okay, so we're just going to solve quadratic equations by completing the square. So our first step is to move c to the right side. So I'm going to, hopefully you know those steps. I'm going to zoom in here, and we're going to do this question right here. So we're going to move c to the right. And we're going to say 5x squared minus 10x equals 40. Then we're going to divide everything by 5 because we want to make sure that a is 1. So we're going to do that, and we're going to get x squared minus 2x equals 8. And then I'm going to take half of b, square it, and add it to both sides. So half of 2 is 1, negative 1. When I square it, I get a positive 1. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides. Remember, I do that to balance the equation. And then I'm going to factor. I'll show you the factoring thing next time. But anyway, it's different when you do vertex form. Okay. That's coming up. So we're going to factor this, and remember, when we factor it, it's always, the reason I added the half of b squared was because I want this to be a trinomial square, and then it factors nice and pretty like that, x minus 1 times x minus 1, which would get you that if you multiply it back through. And now it's ready for me to take the square root of both sides because I have something squared equals something. So then if I square root both sides, the squared and the square root cancel each other out on the left. And on the right, I always get a plus or minus when I square root both sides because there's two answers that get 9 when I square it, 3 and negative 3. So the square root of 9 is 3. So I know that this expression either has to equal a 3 or a negative 3. So what I do is I add 1 to both sides to get x alone, and then get x equals 1 plus or minus 3. So that's 1 plus 3 or 1 minus 3. Those are my answers. So 1 plus 3 obviously is 4, and 1 minus 3 is negative 2, and those are my answers. So that's how we do it when we have a b. So it's just that extra step of dividing both sides by the coefficient. And we've got easy ones to start with, because this is the first time you've ever done this, so we're starting easy, no kind of crazy fractions or anything. Well, one has one, but we're going to change it to a decimal. Okay, so what do? You got to know those steps, because you can't write them down, you got to memorize them. So the first thing we do is get c on the other side. Like that. Then we're going to divide everything by the coefficient, the quadratic coefficient. So we get a is equal to 1. So I get x squared. That goes in there 2 times equals, and 90 divided by 8, 11.25. You can do that in your calculator. So we have a decimal over there, but that's okay because we can put that in our calculator. We're going to take half of 2. Half of negative 2, which is negative 1. We're going to square it, which is 1. We're going to add it to both sides. So we get x squared minus 2x plus 1 equals 12.25. We're going to factor the left side. And then, remember, our next step is to square root. And for this, get your trusty little calculator out. So we're going to square root 12.25. 12.25. And we get 3.5. So we know that x minus 1 equals plus or minus 3.5. So when I add 1 to both sides, I get x equals 3.5 plus 1, which is 4.5, or negative 3.5 plus 1, which is negative 2.5. So those are the two answers for that one. Alrighty, just a couple more. Let's see. Those expressions were rational. Now these ones are going to be, the answers I should say, are going to be irrational. So we still do the same thing. We add 4 to both sides. So we get 2x squared minus 24x equals 4. We're going to divide everything by 2 to get our a equal to 1. So I end up with x squared minus 12x equals 2. And then I'm going to take half of b, which was negative 6. I'm just going to square it, and that gets me a 36. So I'm going to add 36 to both sides. Well, 2 plus 36 is 38. And if I factor this side, I get x minus 6 quantity squared. That's what gets me x squared minus 12x plus 36. And now I am ready to take the square root of both sides. And you'll notice that the square root of 38 is going to be irrational. So these cancel. Get x minus 6 equals plus or minus the square root of 38. So a lot of people have been missing the square root. You need to take the square root there. And now it's a calculator problem. So it's going to be x, when I add 6 to both sides, it's going to be x equals 6 plus or minus the square root of 38. So I'm going to show you how to do that in your calculator so that you don't have to do it, like put it in twice. So if you have a calculator like this, we're going to say 6 plus the square root of 38. And we're going to find the answer. We're going to round to the nearest tenth, so that's going to be 12.2 because the 6 tells us to move the 1 up. So x is approximately equal to, I'm going to use those little squigglies because it's not exactly equal to it, I'm rounding. Or, and then what I do in my calculator is I hit the back arrow till I get to the plus sign, and then I'm going to change the plus sign to a minus sign, and then I don't have to enter that whole expression in again. So that's going to be 0.2, negative 0.2. So, or negative 0.2. And those are my answers for that one. Okay, so you can pause and try to do this one on your own and see how you do it. I'm going to go for it. So we're going to add 20 to both sides. And when I do that, I get this. Then I'm going to divide everything by 2 to get a equal to 1. And you'll notice on this one that we've been nice up to this point, but our b is odd. So if you take half of that, you don't get an integer, you get a rational number. So half of that is 2.5. So I'm going to take half of 5, 2.5, square it. So 2.5 squared, and I didn't put the negative in there because anytime you square a negative integer, or a rational number, you're going to get a positive because a negative times a negative is a positive. So 6.25 is half of b squared. So that's what I'm going to add to both sides, 6.25. So I'm going to say 6.25 plus 6.25, which gets me 16.25. So I'm going to factor this side. So remember what it was, I'm sorry, that would have been 2.5. Let's see if I can make that prettier. Half of 5 is what goes here, or the square root of that, and then this is 16.25. So this is my equation for which I square root both sides because I'm ready to do that. I get x minus 2.5 equals plus or minus the square root of 16.25, and then I would add 2.5 to both sides. So I get x equals 2.5 plus or minus the square root of 16.25. So I'm going to put all of that in my calculator. So I'm going to say 2.5 plus the first time 16, was it 16.25? Yep. And I get 6.5-ish. So x is approximately equal to 6.5 when I round to the nearest tenth. Then I'm going to use my backspace to go to the plus sign, and I'm going to change it to a minus so that I don't have to write that whole thing in again. And that looks like a negative 1.5 when I round to the nearest tenths. So, or negative 1.5. And that is how you solve quadratic equations using completing the square. And again, these were relatively easy ones. We didn't have a lot of crazy numbers, like a lot of fractions. Normally I would do a problem like this with fractions, but because this is our first time, I know that that would kind of scare some people, so I just decided to do it with decimals. Alrighty, good luck with that. M Squared signing out.